The King's Demons, the sixth and final serial of Doctor Who's 20th season, first broadcast in two parts on the 15th and 16th of March 1983. In this particular story, the fifth Doctor, played by Peter Davison, and his companions Tegan Jovanka, played by Janet Fielding, and Vizsla Turlough, played by Mark Strickson, land outside an English castle in the year 1215. Now, while there, they seem to run into the King of England at the time, King John, to which they do actually bring up a few historical facts about, and which do actually check out. Tegan ends up saying, wasn't he the one who ended up losing something in the wash? It's like, yeah, technically he did. He ended up losing the crown jewels in the wash, but not with one of his shirts, no. He ended up losing them to the sea, which, yeah, isn't the smartest thing to do. And it's explained that the time they've landed is 1 year before Magna Carta. So, before he'll have to give up a large chunk of his power. However, they soon find that something is not quite right. King John played by Gerald Flood, appears to be acting oddly. And he's got an entire court, including characters played by Frank Windsor, Isla Blair, Christopher Villiers, Michael J. Jackson, Peter Burrows, and Jacob Lindbergh. But they ultimately discover that this is yet another plan for, well, that another member of his court, Sir Giles Estrom, is actually the Doctor's old nemesis, the Master, played once again by Anthony Ainley. Now, when Turlough was ultimately kidnapped and he discovered the Master, I admit I was a little surprised to find that he didn't know him yet. Considering that Anthony Ainley throughout the 80s was quite a consistent foe for the Doctor throughout the time, but I was a little surprised he didn't know who he was until I looked it up and found the Master's last appearance in Doctor Who before this was Time Flight, and Turlough hadn't been introduced yet. So, you know what? That checks out. That's fair enough. And ultimately, it's small scale, but what the Master wants to do is essentially create chaos. So he essentially wants to discredit King John so that Magna Carta will never be signed, and then history will go to pot, basically. Now, this story, I will admit, I I kind of feel half balanced about it. I don't necessarily think it's terrible, but I don't know if I consider it one of the best. I can definitely say at least one good thing about it, but I can also say one thing that I'm not particularly fond of. So, I'm going to jump in the gun a bit here, going to jump in right to the end, but I'll say that this story is fairly well balanced. I'd probably put it somewhere in the middle in an overall ranking. But one thing that I will admit I do like is that it finally settled something to which I've kind of been arguing against for a long time. And that's whenever I try and do kind of companion rankings or the like, people will usually say with the classic era, "Oh, you've missed Chameleon." I'm just constantly like, is Chameleon a companion? I wasn't sure he was. I mean, Chameleon, who it's ultimately revealed that the King John that they're dealing with here is not actually the real King John. The real King John is uh, heading to London in order to sign something like a Knight's Pact. And this King John is actually a robot, a shape-shifting robot known as Chameleon. And he's also voiced by Gerald Flood. He can change his appearance depending on the will of whoever's nearby. And primarily throughout the story, the main mind that's controlling him is Anthony Ainley's Master, who is kind of getting about the place once again via a TARDIS disguised as an Iron Maiden, which I'll admit is pretty cool. Now, it also does. Chameleon does also figure into my one complaint about the story, but people would always say that he was a companion. I wasn't really sure because I've seen the next five serials that occurred after this one, those being the Five Doctors, Warriors of the Deep, The Awakening, Frontios, and Resurrection of the Daleks. And as far as I remember, Chameleon doesn't actually appear in any of them. But at the very end of the story, the thing that they ultimately do defeats the Master. They manage to overcome his will and get Chameleon in, or get the shapeshifter, which is now shapeshifted into the guise of Tegan, and get it into the TARDIS, where eventually it does revert back to its chameleon robot form. And it does ask to stick around for a while. Well, I think I could stay here. And yeah, well, if that's what it takes, and it does end up being a companion for a few episodes, yeah, I'll accept that. I'll accept it is a companion. It did make it onto the TARDIS, and it did apparently travel with them for a while. My only real complaint that as to why it shouldn't be considered a companion is that, as far as I know, it only ended up appearing in two serials properly. That being this one, The King's Demons, and another one which I'm going to be reviewing next, but I'll get to that. But it only really appeared in two serials. Does it really count as a companion? But I was told, and I have seen that it was originally in scenes from The Awakening. It's stayed aboard the TARDIS, but it was still on board. So yeah, I think I can accept it as a companion. So fair enough. The other thing, though, my complaint about this story, like the thing that kind of balances out and makes it kind of, was that I felt that the ending for this particular story was a bit abrupt. The Doctor and the Master are having a battle of wills over Chameleon, trying to whether it's going to keep its form as King John or whether it's going to be allowed to make its own decisions. That's kind of supposed to be the big battle of it. And eventually they manage to get inside the TARDIS and they take off. And I'm just left thinking, hasn't the Master already caused damage to history? I mean, everyone still essentially hates the Doctor and the companions. I mean, throughout the entire story, King John has been referring to them quite playfully as his demons, which, okay, that's a little odd, but fair enough. And I just kind of feel like, haven't they already messed with things? Haven't they already kind of ruined the view of King John? I mean, King John's viewpoint at that time in history wasn't exactly the greatest, but don't they still have to fix history? Is there not more stuff that needs to be done? It just seems a bit odd. It just seems to kind of cut off there and like, right, we're done with King John, we can go off now. So I just kind of feel they could have done something a bit more, possibly had a bit more with the Doctor having to deal with some of the effects of the Master's intervention, and maybe another great big sword fight between the two might have done well. That's at least what I say about it. So, The King's Demons, I'll admit, it has some points, it has some good ones, it also has a few things that I'm not entirely keen on. But, hey, it introduced Chameleon as a companion, and, hey, I can't wait to see its next story. Its next and final story, actually. But, anyway, the next story I hope I'm going to be reviewing is Chameleon's second and final story, Planet of Fire, which also turns out to be Turlough's last story. So, when I've done that, I'll let you know. Until then, see you then.